All right. Welcome everybody. I see we have a few people joining on the webinar now, so I think we can go ahead and get started. Uh, Thanks everyone for joining for the latest in our OIE upgrade webinar series. This is actually kind of a new mini series that we're kicking off today, focused on sort of the foundational changes in OIE from Classic. So today's session will be sort of the kickoff of that mini series, and this will be followed by in the coming weeks by some deep dive sessions on each of the main areas of change that we're going to be giving an overview of today. My name is Brent Arrington. I'm going to be joined on the call today by several members of our product acceleration team here at Okta who will help answer your questions. On that note, you should see in your Zoom window towards the bottom of the screen, you should see a button for Q&A. As we go through the presentation today, if you have questions, please post those questions there. We will allow for time for Q&A during this session today. But even if we don't get to all of your questions today, please post any questions that you have today, because that will help inform some of the content going forward for some of the upcoming deep dives that we do on this topic. Before we move forward, I'll give the ever-present safe harbor disclaimer here. We may be talking about future-looking items here in the presentation today. So before we dive in, just a quick overview of our agenda. So we'll start off with kind of an introduction overview of today's session and this new series that I mentioned, what it is, what the goal is, what the structure is going to be. And then we'll dive right into our topics for today. So we're going to talk about the new authentication pipeline in OIE. We're going to talk about some changes for authenticators in OIE. We'll talk about the changes for the policy framework in OIE. Some new best practices around custom integrations that you may do for OIE. And then, as I said, we will leave some time for Q&A. And if we have time at the end, we'll go through some resources that are available to you as you prepare for your upgrade to OIE, or if you're already on OIE, to I guess, get more out of the features and functionality in OIE. So with that, first, let me just kind of talk about what this new mini series is all about. So, as I mentioned, this is going to be the first in a series of upcoming webinars that are going to be continuing for the next several months. The goal here is to help provide kind of a deeper understanding of the how and why of the changes in OIE, so that you can then extrapolate the what for your specific custom implementations of Okta. If you think about it, I guess the metaphor would be trying to teach you how to fish as opposed to giving you a fish, right? We can put together a whole grocery list of all the individual items that have changed in OIE, and to some extent we've done that, and that is baked into things like the validator framework. When you go through the self-service upgrade tool and you look at your eligibility report, so a lot of that is already baked in, but there's some things we're just, we're never going to be able to catch everything, particularly when it comes to customers who have custom integrations, specifically, or I guess in particular for consumer-facing use cases, or more complex workforce integrations where you've done some heavy customization of your login page, or end user management screens, things like that. So the structure is going to be a focus on four primary, let's call them pillars of change in OIE. So today's session is going to be an overview of that. So we're going to talk about what those four main areas of change are, go into some high-level detail of what those are. And then, as I said, in the coming weeks and months, this session will be followed up with subsequent deep dive sessions on each of the main areas of change that we're going to talk about today. Specifically, that the first deep dive session is already on the schedule. It's going to be coming up 2 weeks from today, on the 27th of March at 1 p.m. Eastern, 10 a.m. Pacific. And you can already register for that if you're interested. If you scan that QR code, that will take you to the registration screen for that first follow-up deep dive session. So I encourage all of you to do that. And again, I want to emphasize, while we will try to address as many of the questions as we may have today on this session, if you do have questions, please post them into the Q&A here. If we're not able if we don't have time to address them today, they will help drive the content for these deep dive sessions coming up. So please, any questions that you have, even if it's getting into more detail than we're covering today, please post them here, and that'll help kind of guide our topics going forward. So with that, let's talk about sort of the first main area of change that we want to highlight in today's session, and that is the new authentication pipeline in OIE. And really, this is probably the single most recognizable or impactful change from Classic to OIE. The idea here is that we've moved to a much more interactive authentication flow versus the kind of rigid, you know, prescriptive flow that you would have in Classic. It's much more dynamic flow based on a lot of contextual data, whether that's user context, application context, device context, etc. There's no longer a distinction between primary authenticator or a primary authenticator and secondary authenticators. Like in Classic, you would have your password as your primary authenticator and everything else is secondary. There's no longer that distinction in OIE. Everything is just an authenticator, and everything can be treated sort of equally in your policies. So there's no rigid requirement that you provide a password and then MFA. Password can become one of your authenticators. It can become optional. It can become completely disallowed. So this doing away with this distinction makes the passwordless flows that you can implement in OIE much more easily attainable. In addition, there's far more powerful authentication policy capabilities in OIE. So in addition to simply specifying whether whether you require a second factor in addition to your password, here, like as I mentioned, we've done away with that distinction between primary and secondary, but we've also allowed you to get more prescriptive about what kinds of authenticators are allowed or required. So in addition to saying, I'm going to require one factor or two factors for this particular policy, you can say, I'm going to require a phishing resistant factor or a hardware bound factor, or I'm going to require user interaction. You can, if you want, even get so precise as to call out specific authenticators that are either allowed or disallowed for particular policies. So this gives you an ability to define characteristics or constraints around the allowable or the required authenticators for different policies without building in a rigid flow of password then this, or if you wanted to do passwordless in Classic, there was only one way to do it, which was a factor sequencing setup where you would have to explicitly define this authenticator, then this authenticator, and you really kind of, if you're not careful, you can really paint yourself into a corner with those. Here, you can just define characteristics of the types of authenticators that you want to allow or require, and the user still has the flexibility to choose the specific type and the order as long as it meets the requirements that you've set forth in your policy. So all of this gives you more power as an admin in terms of adding your additional security requirements around your policies, but at the same time, it allows for more end user flexibility in how they satisfy those requirements. So all this is great, but what are the implications of that? So I mentioned that this is a new authentication pipeline, and I mean it is completely new. Like this is not just an enhancement of the existing authentication pipeline from Classic. It is a completely new and separate authentication flow. With that, there are completely separate sessions for these two authentication flows. Even the session cookie is different between the Classic style session cookie and the OIE session cookie. Additionally, there are separate endpoints. If you're building your own authentication flows using the auth endpoint, that auth endpoint is the old classic style. It does not support the OIE functionality. The new OIE functionality is a completely separate API endpoints that are available through the OIE SDKs for the OIE flows. And they also use different OIDC grant types. So if you have applications, OIDC applications that you're using when you're building your own custom login screens, the grant types that are used for the OIE flows are different. It's what's called interaction code flow grant type versus authorization code flow with Pixie, which would typically be what you would use in Classic. So I mentioned there are two separate, like this is a whole new pipeline. The existing Classic pipeline still is present even after you upgrade to OIE. So if you've built custom integrations against the auth endpoint, that's fine. You can still upgrade, and those authentication integrations against auth will still work. You should still have backwards compatibility, with the caveat that if everything is going through that flow, if you're kind of looking at it in a silo and everything is continuing to go through that flow, the classic style flow, you really shouldn't see any changes. That should all continue to function pretty much as it has previously. Where you can see issues is when you start mixing flows. So if you have certain scenarios where users are going through a classic flow and they're getting the classic style session, the classic style cookies, etc. But at the same time, other users, or maybe even the same users for different applications, can go through the new OIE flows. That's where you can start to see some issues, both in terms of the authentication pipeline itself, and then as we'll see later on in the presentation, it can have implications for other things like managing authenticator enrollments, etc. Speaking of authenticators, that is the next big sort of area of change in OIE, the authenticators themselves. One big change is that there's no longer a distinction between primary and secondary authenticators. And I kind of touched on this with the authentication pipeline. So there's no longer this notion that password is primary and everything else is secondary. Everything just becomes an authenticator. This, as I already noted, makes passwordless flows a lot easier to set up and implement. It also has implications for your enrollment policies, right? So in Classic, when you have your factor enrollment policies, those policies in Classic only apply to what's considered MFA, like the secondary factors. When you get to OIE, those same policies apply not just to your MFA factors, but password's going to get pulled into that as well because it's also just another authenticator. This change is one of the primary reasons for a very common eligibility item that will get, or acknowledgement item that will get called out in your eligibility report as you're looking to upgrade. If you see the acknowledgement item for a factor enrollment policy set to do not enroll, this is the reason for that call out. Because when you get to OIE, if you have an enrollment policy where you've set that policy to do not enroll, when password gets pulled into that, that's going to apply not just to your so-called secondary factors, but it's also now to password when you get to OIE. So again, the implications of these changes can sometimes affect what sort of behavior you're going to see when you upgrade to OIE. In addition, there's no longer any separation or any distinction between recovery authenticators versus authenticators for SSO or authentication purposes, right? So in Classic, you could register a phone like for SMS or voice call for recovery, and that could be a completely separate thing, a completely separate number from the phone that you enroll for SSO purposes or for MFA purposes. Same thing with email. You could have completely separate enrollments for the recovery flows versus what you would have for SSO purposes. In OIE, that distinction goes away as well. Everything is just an authenticator. Even if it's only for recovery, it's still an authenticator, and everything is now subject to the enrollment policies. Whereas in Classic, those recovery only registrations were not subject to the enrollment policy evaluation. So from a Classic standpoint, like the first time you log in, you might get prompted to set a phone number for recovery, but then after that, it doesn't ask you again because the enrollment policy, the factor enrollment policy, doesn't take that into account in Classic. In OIE, that changes, which is why one of the user experience changes you may see is that users who don't have anything registered for recovery flows, but who are allowed to do self-service recovery could get prompted to enroll in a factor, even if they have other factors already enrolled from an MFA standpoint. If they don't have a factor that specifically will satisfy your recovery policy requirements, then they could get prompted to enroll in another factor because everything now is just an authenticator and everything is subject to the same enrollment policies. In addition, there are some new authenticators, like some net new authenticators that are available in OIE. FastPass is obviously the I guess most prominent one, and it's the one that gets the most attention. This is another authentication method that's built into the Okta Verify app. That's a phishing resistant possession plus inherence factor, provides device context, etc. There's also a new custom push authenticator capability. So you can build your own custom push authenticator if you're developing your own mobile apps, for example, you can build, there's an SDK for you to build your own custom push authenticator into your mobile app. It's very much similar to the push notification from Okta Verify, but you could bake this into your own application now. Obviously, this is net new functionality that is not supported by the old authn endpoint. It's only available through the new OIE endpoints. There are also, in addition to the net new authenticators, there are some new capabilities in existing authenticators. So for Okta Verify, for example, you can now have multiple enrollments for a single user. Whereas previously, you really can only have a single Okta Verify enrollment for one user. Well, there was a way to kind of hack that and cheat to get around it for the OTP specifically. But for the push notification, at least, you could really only have one enrollment per user. Now you can have multiple Okta Verify enrollments per user. Also, for the FIDO2 WebAuthn authenticators, there's now a capability called Authenticator Groups. So you can get more specific about the exact types of FIDO2 WebAuthn authenticators that you want to allow for enrollment. As you may know, FIDO2 WebAuthn is a very broad category of authenticators, so it covers a lot of different things. Some customers have more specific requirements around what they want to allow or disallow for FIDO2 authenticators. So you can now define that, calling out specific types of FIDO2 authenticators, creating those in an authenticator group, and then creating your enrollment policies to reference those specific authenticator groups, and not just everything that would qualify as FIDO2 WebAuthn. And then for phone authenticators, there are some new behaviors associated with phone authenticators. So there's no longer a distinction, at least from an enrollment standpoint, between SMS and voice for phone authenticators. Everything is just phone. Whereas in Classic, when you enroll, you would have a distinct enrollment for SMS and then a separate distinct enrollment for voice, and you can only have one of each. Here, from an enrollment standpoint, it's just phone, and only at the time of the challenge would the user get asked, how do you want to receive this code? Do you want to receive it via SMS, or do you want to receive it via voice call? In addition, you can have up to 10 enrollments for the phone factors. So what are the implications of that? Well, number one, as we kind of touched on, the enrollment policies are going to be applied much more broadly in OIE than they are in Classic. So they're now going to apply it to password authenticator, whereas they never did in Classic. Again, this primarily is going to impact situations where you have your enrollment policy set to do not enroll, but there could be other other implications for that as well, depending on exactly what your factor enrollment or authenticator enrollment policies are doing. Also, recovery only authenticators are going to be part of that enrollment policy evaluation now, whereas they never were before. In addition, all these new capabilities that we've talked about, whether it's new authenticators, et cetera, they're not going to be covered by the Factors API, the old classic endpoint for Factors API. So it's not going to support FastPass. It's not going to support custom push. Additionally, it's not going to support the new capabilities of existing authenticators. So it's not built to support multiple Okta Verify enrollments for a single user. It's not built to support the authenticator groups for FIDO2. And then the new behaviors for the phone factor, for example. It's not built to handle that, I guess, the lack of distinction between SMS and voice. So if you've built your own custom management screens for end users to manage their factor enrollments, these are things that you want to keep in mind and should guide certainly your testing and may require some changes to your code before you upgrade to OIE. All right. So the next big area that I want to talk about is the changes to the policy framework. And this, outside of the new authentication pipeline, this is probably the next biggest sort of signature change in OIE. The first thing is that there's kind of a move to a more app-centric approach in OIE. In Classic, for a number of reasons, the policy structure tended to be very much top-down. So it tended to focus on global policies, and app-level policies were really more of an exception. And that had a lot to do with the fact that it was just such a pain to deal with app-level policies in Classic because of the way that the management of those was structured. But in OIE, in addition to making it easier to manage the app level authentication policies, there's also more context. There's more application context available. There's app context that's associated with every single login. Whereas in Classic, if you're just doing an authentication against the authn endpoint, and that's it, there is no app context there. You would only get the app context when you then try to redirect to an application, whether that's a SAML application or an OIDC app, but you don't necessarily get that app context in every single authentication interaction in Classic, whereas with OIE you do. There's also a much clearer delineation between the session policy versus the app access policy. So in Classic terminology, you would have your global sign-in policy versus your app level sign-in rules. In OIE terminology, you have what's called the global session policy, which is essentially the same thing as your global sign-in policy from Classic, but it's just renamed to make it a little clearer as to exactly what it is and when it's invoked. So it's now global session policy, and your app level policies are your authentication policies, and those have now been pulled out into a separate section where you can define those policies once and then assign them to X number of applications. But the new terminology is intended to give a clear definition of the role of each of those policy types. So your session policy is really all about what is required to just establish an initial session. So if I have no active Okta session at all, that policy is going to get invoked only on that first authentication attempt when I have to establish the session before I can access an application. The app level, the app access policies are invoked anytime I try to access that application, whether or not I have an active session. So your global session policy, would only get invoked maybe once, and then your app level access policies will get invoked every single time you try to access those apps during that active session. So it's a little bit clearer as to exactly when those policies get invoked. You also have an ability now, the global session policy, to defer to the actual authenticator requirements. So, kind of touched on the fact that in the um, app level authentication policies, you've got more flexibility from an admin perspective as far as what kinds of authenticators are required to satisfy that policy. You can now, at the session policy level, defer to the app level policy for whatever app it is that the user is trying to access when they initially establish their session. Defer to that policy as far as what specific authenticators are required, right? So you don't always have to provide a password for your session. You can choose to defer to the app level policy. And if the app level policy allows for, you know, things other than password, or password is either optional or fully disabled, then you can have a fully passwordless flow by configuring your app level policy that way. Um, Again, kind of touched on this, but the prescriptive authenticators constraints. So within the app level policies themselves, you've got the ability to get very specific about not just whether, like, how many authenticators are required, but what kind of authenticators: phishing resistant, uh, hardware bound, does it require user interaction, et cetera. You can even call out specific authenticators by name to either allow or disallow. You also have a lot more device context. And you can create device assurance policies around that additional device context and reference those within your authentication policies. So you can define a device assurance policy that says, for my all of my Macs, it has to be a minimum of this operating system version. It has to have this setting for lock screen. It has to have you know biometrics enabled, et cetera. Right? You can get very prescriptive about what the device requirements are, what the device posture requirements are, and then reference those criteria from your authentication policies um, to make your authentication policies much more robust. And then finally, there is now much more granular control over the recovery and account management policy requirements. So, basically in Classic, from a recovery standpoint, you've got the only real options you have are: do you want, well, number one, do you allow for self-service recovery? And if you do you require the security question as part of that flow, or do you not? And that's pretty much it. Um, Now you have an entire dedicated policy for that you can use for recovery and subsequent account management activities. So, like, if a user is logged in, they have an active session, but they want to modify um, their factor enrollments, or their authenticator enrollments in some way, or maybe change something about their account profile. You can define specific policies around what are the requirements for those end user account management activities as well. So, what does this mean from a practical standpoint for your implementation? So, number one, all this new stuff, all this great new stuff that we're talking about, is only supported via the OIE Authentication Pipeline, right? So, if you've built your own custom login pages and you're using server-side APIs, or using an embedded widget that's operating in Classic mode, you're not going to see any of this new functionality until you change that to use the new OIE pipeline. Also, you have to be very careful about how you define your policies after you upgrade to OIE, if you still have some flows that are going through the Classic flow. So when you're on Classic and you upgrade to OIE, your existing policy structure is going to migrate so that it functionally is one for one for what you have today in Classic. So when you get to OIE and you look at your policies, you're going to see all of the new capabilities there and available to you to start to take advantage of in your policies, but none of them are actually going to be enabled as part of the initial upgrade from Classic to OIE. It's gonna upgrade in essentially a Classic level of functionality. So as you start to edit those policies, you have to be very careful about what flows those specific policies could potentially get invoked in, right? Because if you modify a policy and you start to take advantage of some capabilities that are only supported in the OIE pipeline, and that policy gets invoked through a custom integration that's using the classic pipeline still, you could get some unexpected behavior there. So you have to be very careful about when you're editing your policies, or if you edit your policies, have to be very cognizant of when those policies will get invoked and what sort of flows are going to be utilizing that policy. In addition, application context becomes a lot more critical. So I mentioned as part of the interaction code flow, there's a lot of different contextual data points that are evaluated as part of that interaction. One of those being application context. And again, because there's kind of this shift towards more application-centric policy construction, what app you're trying to access is very important as far as what your policy requirements are going to be. Not just from an app access standpoint, but it could also impact just establishing your initial session as well, depending on how you have your global session policies configured. In addition, that new recovery account management policy capability that I talked about, that can have impact on your end user experience as well, right? So depending on what sorts of authenticators are required or allowed to initiate recovery flows, for example, that could end up in having some users get prompted to enroll in additional authenticators if they don't have enrollments for authenticators that meet that that specific requirement for the recovery settings, even though they may have authenticators that meet all of their SSO requirements. If they don't meet, if they are missing something that would be required for the recovery flows, then that could result in a prompt when they log in. And then again, sort of the underlying point to all of this is that mixing flows between the new OIE flows and the classic flows is a very dangerous thing. Like that can lead to some unexpected behavior. So if you have customizations that are utilizing the authent flow, that doesn't block you from upgrading, but you want to be very very careful, very precise about how you then proceed after you've upgraded, how you move to the new OIE functionality. You want to make sure that as you're doing that, you're not creating situations where you've got a lot of sort of cross-pollination of the two different flows for the same user. Right. And finally, the last big area that I want to touch on today, and this is really kind of all of the other three have kind of fed into this one, but this is really sort of a new direction for recommendations and best practices around custom integrations. And this is not necessarily a complete change from Classic, because some of this is something that we've kind of started pushing for in Classic anyway, but it's really kind of driven home in OIE. Number one, we want to really encourage standards-based authentication flows using redirection wherever possible. Specifically for things like web applications, like OADC web applications or SAML applications, anything that's a browser based, that's maybe not a single page app or whatever. We really strongly recommend that you take a look at using some of the out of the box capabilities around branding and customization to use redirection for those flows. A lot of these capabilities exist in Classic today as well, as far as the multiple brands and the customizations that you can do within each brand. But as you upgrade to OIE, it's a perfect time to kind of reevaluate whether you really need an embedded model, right? Like, is what's available through the out of the box customization with branding, et cetera, does that suffice to give you the level of customization you want while also taking a lot of the work off of your plate as far as implementing all of these new capabilities? So we really kind of strongly encourage you to take this opportunity if you are upgrading and you are kind of you know that you need to make changes to your code in order to take advantage of new functionality. It's a perfect opportunity to um, maybe revisit whether or not redirection is something that can work for your requirements. Um, and then as sort of a, I guess, a next best practice, if you're not going to do redirection, seriously consider looking at the client side embedded model, particularly for browser-based implementation. So this would be the widget, ideally, or potentially the Auth.js JavaScript SDK, which the widget is built on, as opposed to server-side implementations. Again, this is kind of, I guess, the best of both worlds, so to speak. You get, you're hosting it yourself, so you have more control over the embedding page, but the widget itself is kind of a self-contained unit. So all the new functionality that is present in OIE is available through the widget automatically out of the box without you having to update any code, other than making sure that your widget is operating in OIE mode as opposed to classic mode, and you automatically get all of that new functionality. And then finally, if you are doing either server-side or native implementations, the OIE flows are now only available via SDK. So there's no longer any direct like REST API that's exposed for the OIE flows. They're all available through OIE specific SDKs for the various platforms. So if you're using Authn and you're not using an Okta SDK today, you're just doing direct REST API calls. If you want to take advantage of the new OIE functionality, at minimum, you're going to need to move to one of the OIE SDKs, whether that's a server-side SDK or the client-side Auth.js SDK, et cetera. Also, as far as session management is concerned, a lot of kind of legacy implementations would use the sessions endpoint, the REST endpoint, to do session management, either for their own app, kind of piggybacking off of Okta to use the Okta session as sort of a proxy for their own application session, or just managing the Okta session for various reasons. It's highly recommended that you move away from that approach. So there are several options there. One is you can leverage OIDC tokens. If your application is an OIDC based application, you can use OIDC access tokens and refresh tokens to help you replicate some of the behavior that you would get through using the Sessions API previously. There's also a new API that's OIE specific called the My Account API, which you can use to manage the individual end user's session or sessions. There's an ability there to delete all sessions for a user, et cetera. But it's a new API that's based on the specific end user. It's not so much a management API. It's tied to the actual user that's logged in. So it's based on a bearer token that would be associated to the actual end user that's logged in. And obviously, you would want to avoid any of the deprecated sessions endpoints. So in OIE, basically any of the sessions endpoints that directly reference a session by session ID from the server side are deprecated. And this goes back to the changes in the authentication pipeline, right? I mentioned there are completely separate sessions, completely separate session cookies. The session IDs are different. They're a different format in Classic versus OIE. Those session endpoints through the Sessions API that reference ID are all predicated on the Classic style session ID. So while that may continue to work, it is particularly if you're operating in a silo, like you're still running everything through a Classic, like the Authn endpoint integration, that may continue to work for you. If you have any mixing of flows where you have users who are coming in through an OIDC, or excuse me, through an OIE flow, you're not that's those sessions calls are not going to recognize the OIE session ID type. So this one of the, I guess, the most practical ramification there is from an SSO perspective, right? Like um, if I log in through an OIE flow and I get the OIE session cookie, which is called an IDX cookie, and I present the IDX cookie to an application that's using the classic style auth flow, which is looking for an SID cookie, it's not going to recognize that. They're two completely different things. And if I try to you know, like capture that OIE session ID and then use that in a server-side call to retrieve a session by ID, it's not going to find it. It's not going to recognize it at all. And then finally, there is a new user management. There are actually a couple of new user management APIs. I kind of touched on the My Account API earlier. So this is a new API that you can use not just for session management, but also to manage authenticator enrollments for end users. And this API fully supports the new OIE behaviors and functionality for authenticators. There's also a new sign-in experience management API, and you can get to the documentation for both of those APIs with the QR codes that are here on this screen. All right, so I know I've been talking for a long time and I've thrown a lot of information at you. So I want to pause here and let's take a look at some of the questions that we have. Looks like, Asha, you have been feverishly answering away, so I thank you for that. Do we have any outstanding questions that we haven't addressed yet? Let's see. Looks like everything has been addressed so far. Let me see if there's anything I want to kind of call out here.
Yeah, I think, Brent, it would be good to just cover again the global session policy and app session policy. I think there were a couple of questions on that,
Yep.
and then how they're being evaluated together now.
Yep. Let me do this. Let me actually dive into the application here so you can kind of see this a little more clearly. So when you are looking at your policy structure in OIE, so under security, so the global session policy, this is really the same thing as your application sign-on or your global sign-on policies in Classic. It's just kind of rebranded a bit to make it a little clearer as to exactly what it is. But these are the policies here that would evaluate if you don't have an active session. So I open my browser for the first time in the morning. I've not logged into Okta at all. I don't have an active Okta session, and I try to hit an Okta URL or an application that's protected by Okta. This session or this policy or one of these policies, whichever one applies to me, would be the first thing that gets evaluated. And within this, if I look at these policies, so let me look at the rule level here. So within this, you now have a new capability where you can say that the session can be established with either a password and then your MFA requirement, which this is how, if you are migrating from or upgrading from Classic, this is how it would migrate over, because in Classic everything is basically requiring a password and then MFA or not. But now you're going to have this new option to allow for any factor that's used to meet the authentication policy requirements. And this is how you would want to configure your session policies if you want to move towards passwordless eventually, because what's going to happen is instead of explicitly requiring a password to establish your initial session, it's going to look at the application context associated with this request. So whatever app you're trying to access, it's then going to look at your authentication policy, which these are your application level policies now. And if we look at this policy and we see what rule, or excuse me, what specific types of authenticators are required, it's going to look at this. So in this case, this one's specifically calling out a password plus another factor. So in this example, I would still get prompted for a password, but I could change this to say instead of password plus another factor, I could say any two factors. And now I'm not necessarily going to get prompted for a password, but I'm going to get prompted for two authenticators that meet these requirements. So I have to, at least one of them has to require user interaction. But otherwise, everything else is open. So I could satisfy this with any combination of these authenticators that you see here. And by deferring to this policy, I can not only access this application, but I can also use the same authenticator requirement to establish my initial session. So it just allows for a little bit more of a seamless flow when you're initially logging in and you're establishing your initial Okta session. Does that help at all? Hopefully.
I think so. Please keep the questions coming. One thing that also keeps coming up, Brent, is how are we going to share the recording
Yes.
of this? So maybe you want to address that.
Yep, absolutely. So the recording is going to be published to our OIE playlist. And in fact, that kind of ties into, I won't jump too far ahead, but we have a whole list of resources that we can go through here. But one of those is our OIE playlist. Oops, let me go back. Where are we? Actually, I guess I don't have the link for this one directly. Here, let me throw this in the chat window. It was in if you joined early, it was in that sort of pre-webinar scrolling deck, but let me drop the link for that here. Give me 1 second. Here we go. So actually, I'm going to drop a whole bunch of links here. This is, and I'm putting this in the webinar chat. So I just threw about 4 or 5 links there. The OIE playlist on our YouTube channel, that's where all these videos get posted. So that one is linked directly there. It's also linked in some of the other pages that are linked there. The community sites, I have links to that YouTube playlist. I think either the Upgrade Hub or the Resource Hub, I think, has a link to it as well. But the direct link for the YouTube playlist is there in the webinar chat. And typically it takes about a week. So just keep an eye out there. It takes about a week usually for those to get published. So hopefully by late next week, you should be able to find this online. Let's see. Are there best practices? Oh, sorry, it just went away. Where did it go?
Well, I went to dismiss answered because I answered it, but the question
Okay.
was, are there any best practices for integrating with a custom IDP?
Perfect. Okay. All right. Let's see. Any other questions we haven't gotten to yet? So again, I know today's session was very heavy on the slides, and there was a lot of talking, especially like high level information about these areas. We are going to be following this session up with more detailed deep dives into each of the 4 areas that we touched on today. So do keep an eye out for those sessions. The first one coming up next, or not next week, 2 weeks from today, that's going to focus on the new authentication pipeline. So we'll get a little more hands-on in those sessions. We'll actually see some demos of some of the practical implications of those changes and so forth. So keep an eye out for those sessions. All right, let's see. Let me do this. If you're unable to copy those links, let me kind of quickly go through the resources then while we have a few minutes. Um, so one, we have our, uh, actually, this is specifically for managed devices. I think this was a holdover from a previous webinar where we were focusing on managed devices, but there's a specific link for the documentations page there. Uh, this is our upgrade resources hub on our communities or our support site. You can find um, kind of an overview of OIE, links to knowledge base resources. There's a link to our community site there. There's also a link to the YouTube playlist on that site as well. Our upgrade hub, this is really more specific to the upgrade functionality. Um, so it goes through all the different eligibility items that you might run across when you run your eligibility check pre-upgrade. Um, Talks about some of the feature changes in OIE. There's also an example test plan, like an upgrade test plan sample here that you can use to kind of give you some ideas for how to go about setting up a testing structure for your upgrade. And again, sorry, I didn't call this out specifically, but each of these slides, if you're not able to copy from the webinar chat, you can use the QR codes here. If you scan those QR codes here, it'll take you to these links that are being called out. We also have a developer hub. So for those of you who have custom integrations, this is the place you want to go for OIE specific information for developers. So this will talk about API changes, the new OIE SDKs, sign-in widget information, and other developer resources and developer test strategies can all be found here as well. And then finally, our community site. This is where this is a site that our team runs, the product acceleration team. This is where you can go to sign up for office hours. So if you have questions or if you're not clear on certain topics as you prepare for the upgrade, or even if you're already on OIE and you have questions, you can come here and there are links to sign up for one-on-one office hours sessions with myself or one of my colleagues in the product acceleration team. So please take advantage of this. It's a great opportunity for you to get your questions answered or have a little more personal interaction and kind of focus on your specific integrations as opposed to the more general documentation that's out there. You can also we also use this site to post updates for upcoming events like these webinars. It typically will post there when the new videos are available on the YouTube site. So this is a good site to keep bookmarked just to kind of have access to help when you need it or stay up to date on the latest happenings related to OIE.
Brent, there are a couple of questions that I marked as answer live. One is, I don't know if you want to answer them, and then somebody has their hand raised as well. So I can try to take a stab at the first one from Bruce, and then why don't you take the next one, which I don't know who that is from because it's anonymous. So about the restriction question, Bruce, the like Brent explained, it's always a combination of the global session policy and the app policy that are evaluated. So if you need to restrict access for just Okta Admin Console, you can update the Okta Admin Console policy because Okta Admin Console is special too. And Brent might help to actually bring that
Yep.
up.
Let's
Yeah, the Okta Admin Console gets its own dedicated policy. So that one is, you can put the restriction for IP addresses in its specific policy. Anytime you need to apply anything specific to an application, it's better to do it in one of the app policies and then apply that app policy there because the global policy applies to everything in the org. Every single app, whenever a user is accessing the application, it's the global session policy that's evaluated along with the assigned app policy. I hope that clears it up.
Yeah. So if we look at to Asha's point, if we look at our authentication policies, there's a specific policy that automatically gets created when you upgrade to OIE called admin applications. It's going to have your admin console, entitlement management, access requests, admins. These things will automatically be assigned to it. Now, you can change the assignment, the policy assignments for these applications. I would probably recommend that you not do that, just from a clarity of management standpoint. It's probably good to keep these associated here, but you can also edit this policy too. So if you wanted different requirements here, you can manage these requirements here on this admin specific policy. And then let's see, um, what was the next question? So if you enable secondary email at the org level and recovery factors like SMS, Okta Verify for self-service recovery right after your upgrade, would all users who log in after the upgrade be prompted to provide the secondary email, as well as being asked to set up recovery phone authenticator and Okta Verify? And if it allows them to skip, would it ask them would it ask them next? So there are kind of two different things here. One is the secondary email, and the other is the authenticators that are required for your recovery policies. So if we look at, well, first of all, let's address secondary email first. Secondary email is kind of a general attribute on the user profile. If you have secondary email enabled, so that would be a global setting under customizations and other. Here we go. Here. So if you have secondary email enabled and you allow for self-service recovery, because the self-service recovery is really the only thing that Okta uses the secondary email for. So if you have self-service recovery enabled and you have secondary email enabled and the user does not have a value set for secondary email, it's going to treat that as a required attribute, and it's going to prompt them to set a value the first time they log in, and it's going to force them to set a value before they move on. So if you want to avoid that, you could either one, just disable this field if you're not really using it for anything. Again, the only thing Okta uses this for is for recovery flows via email. So if you go through a recovery flow and you use email as your delivery mechanism, it would send the email to both your primary as well as secondary email if you have a value set. So if you're actually using it and you have users that have, you have most of your users who have values set, or a lot of users who have values set, then you probably do want to keep it enabled for that purpose. But if you don't, if pretty much everybody is not really using it, or if they don't have real values there, then it may be easiest just to disable that altogether. Or again, if you just turn off self-service recovery, which is probably not a good option, that would take care of it. Or the other thing that you could do would be to ensure that everybody has some value set there, right? And there are a number of ways you could approach this. A lot of customers will programmatically go through and check to see which users have a value set and which don't. And if they don't have a value set, basically just replicate the primary email value in the secondary email field, so that way they have a value set there. Functionally, it doesn't really make any difference, because if they go through a recovery flow, it's going to get sent to the primary email, which is what would have happened anyway. But it would avoid that prompt. So if you're looking to avoid that prompt, then that's another way to do it. Now, the other thing is the recovery authenticators. So that, if you look at the authenticators themselves, and there's a couple places you potentially could look here. One would be under the password authenticator. This is where in OIE your password policies will move. And this is where you can set rules around your requirements. Now, here you're going to have a couple of options. So this option is deferring to the management authentication policy, but you also can define the rule directly here. So if you're choosing this option to define the rule directly here, then you have these options from a recovery standpoint. You can initiate with Okta Verify push, phone, so that's SMS or voice, email, or Google Authenticator. So the net new here would be the Google Authenticator and the Okta Verify push. Um, Enabling these post upgrade can, for a lot of customers, help mitigate the number of prompts the users may get. Like if you know that your users are using either Okta Verify or maybe Google Authenticator primarily for SSO purposes, if you enable those for recovery, then you're very unlikely to have users get prompted for an additional authenticator because they already have one that would satisfy recovery as well as what they're already using for SSO. So this is one way you can kind of mitigate that. And you can accomplish a similar thing by going to this authentication policy. So if you choose this option, you would go to the Okta account management policy. This is another policy under your authentication policies, but it's a special one that's called out specifically here. And you can define your allowable factor types here in a similar way. So if there are if you know that your user base has something other than phone or email that they're likely to already have enrolled, you can enable those like push or Google Authenticator, and that can mitigate the likelihood of any additional prompts once you upgrade. All right, we are a couple minutes over. I see that we do still have some questions in the Q&A. We do have a record of all these, so thank you for entering those in the Q&A. So we will take these questions and address those in two places. One is I will make sure that we address those on the community site. So if you go back to this link here, I will make sure that we post responses to the remaining questions here on the community site. And we'll also use this to help drive the content going forward as we go into the subsequent sessions on the deep dive topics. All right. On that note, I guess one last thing before I drop here. That next session is going to be, once again, 2 weeks from today on the 27th at 1 p.m. Eastern, 10 a.m. Pacific. Definitely encourage you to register for that if you're interested, and we look forward to seeing you then. Until then, Asha, thanks very much for helping out with the questions today. And for everyone who joined, thanks for your attention and your attendance, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.